Oh, jinx. Every fucking time.
Thank you, disembodied robot lady.
Thank you, disembodied robot lady. Her name is Trish.
Oh, yeah, we decided.
Oh shit, this is delicious. Sorry, I got a fancy.
What are you eating? /drinking. Oh, is that the chocolate stout?
It's like a coffee chocolate stout.
So this is a double mocha chino unrefined beer.
I want it.
Yeah, it's mad fucking good.
That's very nice.
Like, I don't know.
Can you pour something over your keyboard? Can you pour something over your keyboard?
I am not going to. That's a terrible.
I'll do it.
No.
I'll like spritz some at the camera. At the lens.
Please. It's so sugary.
I'll just come over soon and steal your beer.
This is just to say I have ruined your laptop. Forgive me. It was delicious.
Man, when I was editing the Storytime book, I got back to your version of the "This is just to say" poem about being a shitty flatmate. It was just so fucking funny. I cracked up the entire goddamn time again.
Yeah, we did a poem and people liked it. Look at us. Poetry. Fucking love that shit.
Well, you both have helped me with my poems, so that makes sense that you would be able to write good poems on your own.
Hi,
Hi.
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 Rory Lyric read me that poem about the little kid with the dinosaur in the bus looking out of the window and seeing the fucking dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs in the hood.
Dinosaurs in the hood. That's like
Such a good poem.
such a good poem.
It's not quite sci-fi, but it is on like the fantasizing about what the world could be like. And do you think we could work it into Sci-Fi Week just so there's an excuse to read it on Saturday?
It's sci-fi enough that there are dinosaurs on the street. Right?
Yes, I like that.
Yeah, we could like cheat sneak it in. It's just so good. Roy sent it to me a while ago, and then it came up in my course, and I was like, yes, of course the dinosaurs in the hood poem would be in this fucking course somehow. So I started attempting the swan poem. I was asking people for facts and talked to some folks about facts yesterday, and had messaged Rory and Brackett ahead of time being like, friends, give me your facts. So
I saw that. I thought that was your plan.
yeah, so I decided to collect more swan facts with the ideas of like pulling at them for metaphors. So I played with that a bit, and then I talked to Bracken about one of the other prompts. So I'm also working with that one if I can't make the swan one work. And I feel like both of them have the potential to be good poems, but whether or not I can make the concepts work with my skill levels at this point is a whole other thing. So yeah, instead, I'm also trying like absurd writing about one of your biggest fears, but like making it as ridiculous and over the top as possible. So I'm writing about having an empty funeral, but instead of empty, like all of the people who are going to be there are going to be like characters and shit like that. Bracken was helping me brainstorm ideas. There's a lot of Sesame Street and the Muppets around my feet. And they're all judging me. All of them.
I tried to suggest having a like disembodied personification of Jareth the Goblin King's crotch, but it didn't fly.
I mean, I just don't know how I'd work it in. I'll write it
I
down.
know how you could work it in.
It gets bitten by a swan.
Sex joke.
You know how a swan is strong enough to break a man's arm? It's not Jarrett's arm.
Labyrinth was a formative experience for me, okay, guys?
That's
Yeah,
okay.
a lot of formation.
There's a lot of formations things.
Before I had ever even seen Labyrinth, I made friends with people who had watched it a bunch in high school. So I got jokes about Labyrinth long before I ever watched it. And then I watched it and was like, wow, these people make a lot more sense. So yeah, forever, like, whenever someone says something like that involves Remind and Babe, I'm just like, you remind me of the Babe.
What
The
babe?
The Babe with the power.
What power?
The power of the voodoo.
Okay, that's enough.
But we were so close. Fair. Yeah, anyways, like I know that whole sequence. Like, I still forever.
Hey, can I be Katie McAllister today?
Yeah, please do.
Is it?
Also, just so you know, Andy, some people are at D&D and are going to catch up.
Yes, hello
You
D&D
didn't lose people. They just have D&D. So hi, Malcolm and Dina and anyone else who's busy.
Hi, Catcher Crew.
We miss
Hi,
your
Catch Up Crew.
faces.
Okay. Is it time? You guys ready? Story time.
All right. Does everyone remember the setup from yesterday? Right. We have old history. A bunch of children that are prodigious are hidden away somewhere instead of being locked away as the queen instructed. And in nowadays, which is still maybe the 1800s or so, we have a person interviewing an actress for the role of the wife and a teenage boy who's up to no good for the role of his teenage son. We have a kind of failing history teacher trying to find a job with not much success, but lo and behold, there is one job offer in this almost unheard of town of Rotherwierd that does not deal with the outside world, and outsiders do not come in, and nobody studies history except for modern history. So yeah, we'll see how that pans out. And in the middle of the night, while this guy was going back home from the interview, they nearly crash with a great big Rolls Royce driven by the guy and his fake wife and his fake child. Yeah, our historian was successful in the interview, and now we are moving on to a scene in the town. Is everyone sitting comfortably? Then I shall continue. Chapter 4, A Sale. Behind the front window of Baubles and Relics on the Golden Mean, Rotherweird's only antique shop, a bewildering array of objects jostled for the attentions of passers-by. A hippopotamus head peered down at an elephant's foot. A Victorian microscope stood between two turbans. Assegais hung from the webbing of snowshoes, and a giant marionette of Father Time rode a rocking horse, arms and scythe suspended from the ceiling with fishing line. Mrs. Banter owned the shop, but her niece Aurelia Rock ran it, gathering stock from junk shops and house sales in the outside world. The visual wit in the display was entirely Aurelia's. On the night of Mr. Oblong's interview, aunt and niece sat beside the small fire at the rear of the shop, balancing sales and acquisitions, as ever a fractious exercise. "That," shrilled Mrs. Banter, pointing at the hippopotamus head, "is a disaster." "It's a talking point." "How many times? This is a selling shop, not a talking shop. And remember, I only stoop to trades to give you work." The familiar lecture was interrupted by a knock on the door. "Tell them we're closed. Can't people read?" There was something of the gypsy about Aurelia Rock, alluring and intimidating at the same time. Her hair was dark, long and curly, her eyes mischievous and a deep hazel. Men admired from a distance, but whose, to her disappointment, few attempted to get to know her. She wore brass bangles, a worn pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and a frayed woolen scarf. By contrast, Mrs. Banter's jersey was cashmere, her shoes glossy patent leather. She lived in a prestigious tower house in the north of town. Such was the imbalance in their rewards from the business. Aurelia had been much closer to her late uncle, Bartholomew Banter, than his wife. He was her mother's brother, an architect with a genius for inserting arresting new structures into Rotherweird's tangle of houses, towers, and walkways. In widowhood, Mrs. Banter gave her social ambitions full rein, working her way into snorkel soirees and onto the board of the Rotherwierd Riparians, a town charity where the well-heeled preached more philanthropy than they practiced. Keen to open a luxury store, Mrs. Banter invested in a vacant property on the Golden Mean, only to balk at the capital outlay and the cost of staff. When her orphaned niece returned to Rotherwierd and offered the compromise on an antique shop, which she would run for a modest pay and rooms above the premises, Mrs. Banter agreed to a 2-year probation period. Antiques, after all, traditionally attracted the well-to-do. Although, in the event, Aurelia's choice of merchandise veered more to the eccentric than the antique, the shop quickly moved from barely washing its face into profit, and Aurelia stayed on, despite the cultural gulf between her and her aunt, who had a gift for materializing when the grander customers called, but not otherwise. Nearer 30 than 20 and in need of adventure, Aurelia had no intention of allowing their mystery visitor to escape. Through the spy hole in the front door, the man outside appeared and disappeared disconcertingly, but the white-brimmed hat and the laced leather boots were familiar. "It's Haman." "You mean the tramp?" said Mrs. Banter, knowing full well who it was. "Haman Salt." Aurelia opened the door. "Hey, man," she said, her traditional welcome to the curmudgeon with whom she had good rapport. Salt, head of Rotherwield's Municipal Gardens Department and its chief plantsman, maneuvered his bulk through the doorway. In the warmth of the room, he steamed like a kettle. The unflattering title bestowed by Mrs. Banter had been applied by others, but he was no tramp, having both a respectable home and employment. But in several respects, the description fitted. A face ruddied by weather wore the tramp's ambiguity of expression, flitting from careworn to carefree. His shaving lacked skill, and his mane of graying hair was unkempt. A darker reason lurked behind the jibe. Salt would periodically disappear into the countryside for what he called field trips. Town rumor suggested that he even fraternized with countrysiders and visited their homes. However, there could be no disputing his quality as a plantsman. The town's formal beds and the less manicured grove gardens boasted a range of hybrids unique in England, each immodestly marked with a metal nameplate ranging from Haman's Arum to Haman's Zinnia. Yet humor leavened his vanity. When the mayor complained about the lack of a tribute to him, Snorkel's Petunia appeared. The petals a hideous mix of orange, yellow, and green, and the scent putrid. In Rotherwierd, where scientific prowess was commonplace, nobody thought to ask how Haman Salt could be so prolific a creator. His visits to baubles and relics had a common purpose: the sale of archaeological finds from Roman military buckles to coins of modest value, unearthed during his excavation work. He would come in his lunch hour, declare his goods, haggle with Mrs. Banter, and seal the deal with a glass of her sickly sherry. "You're dripping!" shrieked Mrs. Banter. He tossed his hat and coat to Aurelia, who felt a hard object bounce off her hip. A trowel. She checked the other pocket as Salt squeezed into the middle chair by the fire. A sheaf of polythene bags, but hardly the weather or time for planting or lifting. Without his usual small talk, Salt produced from his jacket pocket 4 colored stones in red, blue, brown, and white. The coloring faintly mottled, but rich, each perfectly round and matched in size. Aurelia noted tension in Salt's shoulders, as if he wanted both to keep the stones and be rid of them. The two women peered at the merchandise. Mrs. Banter saw profit. Aurelia felt an intangible presence. "Where'd you find them?" asked Mrs. Banter. 10 guineas each. Take it or leave it. Aurelia saw the stones as elemental: fire, water, earth, and air, and her reaction to them triggered an instinctive insight. They were not decorative, they did something. Mrs. Banter misread Salt's brusque response as a new negotiating technique. "Beads are 2 a penny. Still, I'll allow they're pretty. 3 guineas each and a guinea for thinking of us." "They're beautiful," added Aurelia, taking issue with her aunt's meanness. 2 guineas for thinking of us," added Mrs. Banter with a grimace. 10 guineas each, repeated Salt with an edge to his voice. Mrs. Banter, pale with irritation, conceded. Salt's old self resurfaced as Aurelia poured the drinks. "Trick or treat," he exclaimed, giving Aurelia a handful of bulbs from his other pocket. "Hayman's croquet." With a greenish tinge to the roots and blue blotches on the papery outer skin, the bulbs held promise of unique blooms to come. Mrs. Banter declined to offer the tramp a second glass. As Aurelia showed him out, he whispered, "Odd things, those stones. Get rid of them far away if I were you." Mrs. Banter, whose haughty exterior concealed a mind like an abacus, turned on her niece as the door closed. "That show of sentiment cost me 26 guineas. He knows where to hold a price. They're probably stolen." "Aunt, really? You don't know where he goes at night." Mrs. Banter sprinkled her conversation with references to her customers' more secretive movements, especially after dark. "Knowledge is influence," she had once declared obliquely to Aurelia when challenged about the habit. As Aurelia bemoaned the loss of her uncle's restraining influence, Deirdre Banter moved on to practical matters. "The label will say ancient Rotherwierd comfort stones." "Being what exactly?" "Medieval worry beads." "Right. Price on application. You have to be above trade to understand trade. If only your mother had taught you that." With this swipe at her late sister-in-law, Mrs. Banter pocketed a fistful of notes from petty cash and joined her waiting rickshaw taxi. Aurelia labeled the stones as instructed and chose an inconspicuous place, hoping to buy time for further investigation. She chose well. Nobody showed any interest, and with much else to occupy her, she thought less and less about them. Salt's discomfort did not ease. Suppression of the truth could be as bad as a lie. He did not know what the stones did, but he did know where he had found them, and that was disturbing enough. He prayed that they would end up in someone's jewelry box, unloved and unused. Chapter 5. Oblong tries to learn the form. Oblong's attempts at reconnaissance were not productive. Maps confirmed the valley's secluded position and its one-access road, but were otherwise stripped of detail. The town itself did not even appear. The Rother, too, seemed shy of the outside world, emerging from the base of the northern hills, only to plunge underground once more near Rotherweird's southern boundary. Guidebooks described Rotherweird's community as secretive and hostile. Visitors should expect to be turned away or ejected at dusk without transport. A unique plant, the Rotherwierd eglantine, grew haphazardly under the oaks of the island field, a large meadow south of the town, surrounded by a tributary of the Rother, but outsider botanists were barred access. The rundown camper van, the surly driver, and the portcullis were no doubt part of the same deterrent strategy. A detailed list of instructions headed Outsiders and Countrysiders promptly arrived in the post. Outsiders covered anyone from the outside world, and Countrysiders anyone from the Rotherwierd Valley who did not live in town. Neither Outsiders nor Countrysiders were permitted to stay overnight, imported teaching staff being the one exception, but the rules still denied oblong lodgings on the Golden Mean or Market Square. According to a footnote, he did qualify for the town's special festivals, of which only 2 were mentioned: the Great Equinox Race and Vulcan's Dance. A large package followed, containing 2 gowns, one with a purple stripe on the sleeves, form master, and one with a green stripe, history teacher. The covering note read, "Regalia enclosed, check for size. Yours most sincerely, Angela Trimble. P.S. And no old world accoutrements such as computers or talking machines. We study by the book and we talk face to face." When the afterglow of the gowns had worn off, nagging questions took root. Why had Rotherwierd School chosen him? Why had it not asked for references? Why had Rhombus Smith not mentioned his predecessor? Had he or she been an outsider too? But these thoughts did not deter Oblong, they intrigued him. He wrote that evening to Rhombus Smith. "Dear Headmaster, please send last year's reports and suggested history subjects. Yours, Jonah Oblong." The requested reports came by return with a covering note in a cultured hand. "Dear Mr. Oblong, how delightfully enthusiastic. Material as requested. Great Depression. With kind regards, Rhombus." The reports divided between pupils from the town, white paper and the great majority, and countrysiders from the surrounding valley, green. The former were honored with Christian names, the latter listed only by initials at the end. Again, a whiff of discrimination. The form master's name had been erased, as had that of the previous teacher of modern history. Oblong decided against the Great Depression and in favor of the American Civil War, a subject on which he had expansive notes and which should have been something for everyone. He immersed himself for the next week in the causes and the opening engagements. He would have time enough in Rotherwierd to master the rest. Chapter 6. Strange Company. Oblong returned, as instructed, 4 days before the start of term. The journey followed his first train to campervan to Carabank, but with frost on the ground and a cloudless sky. Through rolling fields, orchards, and occasional farms, Rotherwierd town, with its 2 peculiar bending bridges and a forest of towers, danced in and out of sight. A rocky escarpment rose sheer from the riverbank on the northeastern side, its prominence emphasized by the town's single church, whose crenellated stone tower dominated the skyline. Further east, beyond the river, stretched a forbidding expanse of marshland, relieved only by a single prominence to the south, on which stood a watchtower, now deserted, and, to judge from the absence of any track or road, unreachable. For variety, Boris delivered him to the North Gatehouse this time, leaving Oblong free to progress down the Golden Mean to the school, over whose entrance hung a cast-iron book attached to a pair of spectacles. Beyond, he could see a series of interconnected quads, the open spaces laid to grass. The porter's lodge, its wall honeycombed with pigeonholes, guarded the gateway. Miss Trimble was on duty. If dressed less severely, with her hair let down in both senses, she would be attractive in a Juno-esque way, mused Oblong. He tapped the glass. Ah, she said, back for more, as if greeting the proverbial bad penny. Feeling more like a new boy than a teacher, he trotted behind her to the form room. The quality of the equipment and prevailing tidiness impressed. Wall charts illustrated the evolutionary stages of the frog and the chickenpox virus, but in a degree of scientific detail unusual for the age group. Miss Trimble appeared embarrassed by their presence and hastily rolled them up. Her unease prompted the thought that he must have had two predecessors, the form master, clearly a biologist, and the modern historian. He checked the exercise books for biology and history, although, as in the reports, both their names had been excised, their handwriting was very different. Detecting the scent of suppressed scandal, he gently challenged Miss Trimble, who replied curtly that Rotherwierd School did not do nostalgia, and advised him to concentrate on present colleagues. Most are back, and they all like their tea. The staff room is over there, through the big oak door and left. Then back to me for your lodgings. Silence descended as Oblong entered, and a sea of unfamiliar faces examined him from head to foot. An early middle-aged man in a tracksuit broke the ice. Boris said to keep an eye out. I'm Gregorius Jones, PE. Healthy mind in a healthy body. And your posture, if I may say so, is deplorable in one so young. I do a free staff Pilates class on Tuesday evenings if you wish to arrest your physical decay. But now it's introductions. Most were cursory in their welcome, though not rude. The warmest greeting came from a jovial man, conspicuous for a surprisingly successful combination of large ears and aquiline nose. Meet the one and only Vese Bolitho, said Gregorius, head of the South Tower Science Faculty and a resident astronomer. Bessie and I share a common interest in heavenly bodies and perfect motion. Delighted. I always welcome a stray visitor to our strange cosmos. Bolitho lowered his voice. It's sad the statutes do not permit at least a middle-aged historian. Galileo, Brahe, Copernicus. Such men are my heroes. I teach their teaching, but nobody can teach their times. Still, one black hole is better than several. Do drop by one evening. I have a decent telescope near the South Tower. Meantime, he gestured to the seething mass of teachers. Circulate like a planet if you wish to be a star. In Bolitho, Oblong detected a welcome sense of mischief. And make your friends from the South Tower, whispered Gregorius Jones. Why so? Their science is nicer. Oblong circulated, struck by how colleagues addressed each other by surnames. An old-fashioned formality flourished in Rotherwierd School. Least welcoming was Hengist Strimmer, a youngish man with half-moon glasses and curly dark hair, of precocious talent presumably, being head of the North Tower Science Faculty. A colleague, Vixen Valorhand, slim and slight with short hair, hung back, looking more bored than hostile. Strimmer declined Oblong's proffered hand. Remember the last historian, Strimmer said to Jones. 50 guineas, this one doesn't make the next term. Vese Bolitho returned, and Gregorius Jones went with him. Oblong did not resent his isolation. Respect had to be earned. He decided to explore. The music school had the latest in recording technology. The modern language facility and Babel building and the imposing gym were no less blessed. So a remarkably endowed school with no visible tribute to any benefactor. The South Tower Science Faculty boasted a large dome, Vese Bolitho's observatory. Access to the North Tower Science Faculty proved less easy. In a remote quad, a long iron fence with sharpened railings offered only one narrow gate. presently open, but festooned with a rosary of padlocks and the off-putting sign, North Tower Science Faculty, Academic Appointments Only. Deciding he could stretch reconnaissance to an academic appointment, Oblong slipped through, only to leap back. The mastiff's jaws missed his thigh by inches. Teeth bared, revealing mottled black and pink gums, the dog snapped, growled, and snapped again. Strimmer emerged from the gloom. Can't you read? Sorry, I thought. Strimmer put on an infantile voice. I'm an outsider. I have no time for petty rules. I'm just puzzled as to why this faculty is so well defended. Oblong shuffled forward. The dog lunged, Strimmer smiled, and Oblong took a pace back. The mastiff reverted to nuzzling the back of Strimmer's right thigh, programmed apparently to love his own and to attack anyone else who crossed the lintel. Oblong dangled a toe. Another snap. Call yourself a historian. The wise guard their valuable resources. Strimmer patted the animal's head. It's test tubes for pleasure. Oblong denied Strimmer the satisfaction of an immediate retreat. Perhaps you knew the last modern historian? Well enough to know they'd choose an imbecile to replace him. Discretion finally triumphed over valor. Oblong returned to the porter's lodge. I met a charming man with a charming dog. It can be hard to tell them apart, responded Miss Trimble with a flicker of a smile. Maybe he could make a friend or two in this unusual school. The thought emboldened him. What does the South Tower do? They design light entertainment for the outside world, from toys to telescopes. And the North Tower? Miss Trimble turned her wrist and glared at her watch. You'd best be getting on, she replied. She provided keys, an address, 3 Artery Lane, and a succinct summary. First left, third right, second left, fourth right, down a cul-de-sac, left again at the end, right, left, almost to the town wall. Oblong found himself engulfed in the bustle of a market town without cars. Bicycle rickshaws, lovingly decorated and powered by Boris Polk's vacuum technology, served as taxis, their occupants in the seasons swathed in brightly colored blankets. Their bells and the warning cry, "Rickshaw!" formed an integral part of Rotherwierd street music. Between them darted conventional bicycles, front baskets filled with books or produce. Clothes had color and variety for both sexes, with a bewildering array of different styles, be it hats, trousers, or coats. Rotherweird's designers, keen to be self-sufficient and original, had gone their own way. Shops, now closing, declared their wares or services on swinging hand-painted signs. Streets bore their names on rectangular iron plates set in the walls, painted white on dark green. While the Golden Mean, running north-south, was direct and generous, side streets were narrow and rarely straight. In darker alleys, half-timber houses bent towards each other in greeting. Towers of oak and plaster dominated architecturally, with several joined by suspended covered passages, some tall and thin, others short and stubby, many twisted by time, all with windows. At lower levels, too, bridges joined buildings, creating below them havens from bad weather, settings for gossip, and betrayed secrets. Elaborate balconies hung from the lower levels of the more prosperous towers. Exterior staircases wound up to doors in the oddest places. In daytime, with such a varied skyline, light and shadow constantly shifted at street level. In Market Square, the hub of town, shops and stalls clustered around the imposing facade of the town hall, one of the few buildings built of dressed stone. The shops were owned by townsfolk. the mobile stalls by local countrysiders whose names were emblazoned across the awnings. As dusk eased into night, the stalls, also vacuum-powered, were being guided home to their respective farms. The portcullis rose punctually to allow their escape. Countrysiders could not lawfully stay beyond 7 o'clock. Market Square was in effect a roundabout, thanks to its central tower set on stilts and hung with oak shingles, whose four-sided clock halfway up chimed citizens to church and municipal meetings. Higher up, the tower bulged to accommodate the enormous single bell that gave the structure its name, Doomstockson. Number 3 Artery Lane proved to be a misnomer, less artery and more an insignificant vein in Rotherweird's complex circulatory system. Oblong's rooms occupied the highest habitable level of a ramshackle tower, reached by a creaking wooden staircase that had not quite rotted through. He had a small kitchen and bathroom, as well as a comfortably furnished bedroom and study. The panelled walls were stained dark. From his study window he could see the foaming rush of the Rother. His spirits rose when he saw a vase of paper flowers, supplies in the kitchen, and a laid fire in the study. He was on tiptoe on a chair, arranging his books, when he was ambushed by a croaky woman's voice. "I'm your general person. People call me Ags." Oblong clung on as the chair tipped back. 2 firm hands righted him, and he turned to find a short lady with frizzy white hair and teeth like tombstones. Late middle age, he guessed. "I does all the school-town lodgings," she continued, describing the reach of her empire with a sweep of a hand. "You and Thingamy and Mr. Whatsit over there." "Hi." Oblong shook Ag's proffered hand. She had a grip like granite. "A flirty yourself. How about that?" "Very nice, very suitable." "Suitable for what?" "Study and repose." "Study and repose. You keep to that, and I'm an Austrian," retorted Ags with a knowing wink. Oblong, sensitive to the demands of overtime, suggested she need not stay so late. "Need tells me my hours, Mr. Oblong, and in my book, welcomes and farewells come first." Oblong asked what a general person did. "What he makes of her. Cook, cleaner, washer, and spy," retorted Ags as she put on some toast in the kettle. "We're gonna be friends." "Ags as in Agatha?" "Agapanthus. Even Mr. Smith don't get that right. Now you get some fuel inside you, or you'll get those books all wrong. Some goes by height, some by subjects, and some alphabetical. I'm a subject person myself. Why put pillows in with saucepans?" As he obediently consumed his second tea, Ags delivered instructions on working fridge and cooker, a weather forecast for the coming month, a list of essential shops, the opening and closing times of Rotherweird's only pub, the Journeyman's Gist, and to conclude, an assurance that he would have no trouble with Form 4. He had only to turn up at 8:30 on the first day of term, gowned. "Were you my predecessor's general person?" "Not one of mine, if he ever had one." There are good liars and indifferent liars, and a few, like Ags, whose lies were so obvious they could hardly be called liars at all. Her face turned to candor went awry. Eyebrows arched and nostril flared as she looked at her shoes. Oblong decided against inflicting further misery. She was clearly acting under orders. Mini hydration break. For 2 days, Oblong kept mainly to his rooms, in part to avoid worsening weather, in part from shyness, and in part from a determination to be fully prepared for his first class. Ags had stocked his cupboards with an array of supplies, so there was no pressing need for more shopping. On his last free evening, Oblong decided to be more adventurous, only to encounter two buildings with a declared hostility to visitors. The first hid behind a high wall displaying intermittent signs in red script. Prohibited quarter, Rotherwierd Manor, keep out. Despite this injunction, heavy restoration work appeared to be in progress. The second, a fine building open to view, boasted an equally forbidding message in a plaque set in the wall, which read, Escutcheon Place, and beneath it, Armian Finch, Herald of Rotherwierd, no visitors. The exterior of Escutcheon Place was a park. Stone snakes found their way up oak beams either side of the double front door. 4 griffins cast in lead stood guard along the top cornice. Shields were set above each window, and a magnificently florid R for Rotherwierd adorned the double doors. In the manor and the herald's house, apparently the town's oldest properties and both barred to visitors, must lurk the reason for Rotherweird's peculiar constitution, he decided before rebuking himself. He had a contractual obligation to keep to 1800s and thereafter, if addressing the world beyond the valley, and to treat Rotherwierd history as off-limits entirely. Here he must live in the moment. Private speculation could only lead him astray. At intervals along the Golden Mean and the other major streets, open stairwells with extravagant names like Jacob's Ladder and Blind Man's Stair spiraled up like helter-skelters. Oblong passed several before realizing that they gave access to an open aerial walkway, Ether's Way, which straddled the prosperous western quarters of the town at various levels. He ascended and found rows of craftsmen and traders huddled in competitive groups, each with a shop front and an elaborate iron sign. Some of the signs were static, others had tiny metalwork doors opening and shutting, chemist's jar emptying and refilling, letters changing color, clock hands rotating, models walking, flying, and flapping wings. Intermittently, he chanced on more grandiose facades sculpted with scenes illustrative of particular skills. Rotherweird's guild halls. Oblong set about collecting them and noting their whereabouts. In the coming week, he discovered 10. The carvers, glassblowers, bakers, timekeepers, tanners, milliners, metalworkers, toy makers, masons, and mixers. Only 2 eluded him. On Ether's Way, the traders were not unfriendly. Word appeared to have traveled fast, with "Evening, Mr. Historian," swiftly becoming a common refrain. He found it invigorating, watching other walkers pass below as he tried to assemble the working pieces of this extraordinary town. One tower, Vlad's, Rotherweird's distillery and purveyor of spirits, whose shop front opened onto Ether's Way, boasted brass bubbles at uneven intervals on the tower sides. The window display was impressive for the variety of bottles in shape and color and their contents, whiskies, gin, brandies, and wines, both ordinary and fortified. Rotherweird's sole pub, the Journeyman's Gist, was his final port of call. The inn sign depicted a traveller, hand to ear, as if garnering intelligence. Above, the name of the landlord, Bill Ferdy, whose brew Feisty Peculiar had so impressed. In keeping with the prevailing style of the walls, a mix of white plaster and dark oak beams enclosed one large room with several tables set between a crowded bar at one end and a blazing fire at the other. On one side were wooden stalls where board games were being played. Rugs softened the flagstone floor. A powerful man with a friendly face addressed him from behind the bar in a country burr. "Who be thou then? I'm sure to be asked." "I'm the new teacher." "I'm Bill Ferdy." The landlord's handshake nearly dragged Oblong behind the bar. Not history by any chance? Spot on, said Oblong. About time. It's in the statutes. We can't be without one for more than a term. Anyway, thank the Lord you don't look like that Flask fellow. Bill Ferdy put his finger to his mouth in a gesture of self-rebuke. Whoops. Mum's the word. The first pint is on the house, Mr. Historian. Why the journeyman's gist? Just be old English for foam and bubble and yeast, and the nub of things, as any journeyman wants, right? Oblong nodded as Strimmer walked in with his fellow North Tower scientist, Vixen Valorhand. Strimmer elbowed Oblong aside. Manners, Mr. Strimmer, manners, said the landlord. Is a historian. And I'm a landlord and you're a scientist, so? Ferdy placed his sizable fists on his hips. Rather than provoke a fracas, Oblong retreated to a far corner and tried with little success to recreate his walk in verse. At least he now had a name for his fellow historian, Flask. Between verses he caught the stare of an older man sitting in shadow at the far end of the room, though he appeared more inquisitive than hostile. When he next looked up, his observer had gone. They were never going to risk another Flask, muttered Strimmer into his beer, flicking his head in Oblong's direction. But that idiot? Once bitten, twice shy, agreed Valorhand. Strimmer assumed that his former pupil, a physicist and now the most junior member of the North Tower staff, was still enthralled to him, despite his ending a brief physical intimacy with brutal abruptness. He had been attracted by her cutting turn of phrase, the green-grey eyes and russet hair, Vixen being a school nickname awarded as much for her independence of spirit as her colouring. But why let a bloody outsider into the manor? What's Snorkel playing at? Asked Strimmer. The outsider paid through the nose. I've seen his car. Black, shiny, and big. Trough time for Snorkel, that's why. His eyes glinted. Valorhand knew the look. Strimmer sensed opportunities. How did Flask know an outsider would take over the manor? Flask always said, find the past to read the future. Perhaps he was right. Pseudobabble, replied Strimmer dismissively. Flask also said he would take the town over, which makes sense. Why else would an outsider come here? Our independence attracts him. He wants to rule. Valorhand saw the flaw in her own argument, but kept it to herself. Rule here, but to what end? He did not need the money. He did not know the people. Was it a valueless exercise in conceit? She thought not. She had glimpsed his face through the window of his Rolls-Royce, and did not look that type. Strimmer underestimated Valorhand. She led a double life of which he knew nothing, and she had her own ambitions, albeit with no settled direction. She had had her own conversations with Flask and had kept selected details to herself. She wondered what else Flask had discovered and how it connected to his disappearance. Behind the ornate walls, columns and architraves of Escutcheon Place, lived Marmion Finch, holder of the town's one hereditary office, Herald of Rotherwierd. Finch after Finch after Finch had ranged through these lugubrious corridors. His known duties, as recorded here and there in the weighty 24 volumes of Rotherweird's regulations, had an air of quaint formality. He regulated the carvings that decorated the town's roofs, balustrades, door knockers, and weather vanes. Different families had exclusive rights to different emblems. And he controlled quality too, his imprimatur being required for the elevation of any apprentice to master carver. He had a right of veto over new structures, although by convention he rarely exercised it. He kept the registers of births and deaths. He calculated the dates of feasts and rituals, a task requiring no more than a rudimentary grasp of the lunar calendar. And the office imposed other burdens, unknown to Rotherwierd citizens. Marmion Finch held the town's only copy of the Rotherwierd Statute, under whose disturbing terms the valley had obtained her independence, and he alone had read it, being exempt from the history regulations. He kept and guarded the historical records, shelves and shelves of them in the archivoire, the great library in the heart of Escutcheon Place, which only he was allowed to enter. He stood alone in other ways too, having succumbed to his father's insistence that he marry for social connection, not love. Mrs. Finch had turned out to be a snob in Rapture to Snorkel's circle. Under her influence, his son and heir had acquired similar priorities. As a consequence, his work became his life. On the evening of Oblong's tour, every volume of the Rotherwierd regulations stood open, covering the 6 tables in the bays of the archivoire. He had scoured them all in vain for a law prohibiting the manor's reopening, or, failing that, its sale to an outsider. He did not like the outsider's showy car, or his face, or the weasel motif which had reluctantly been passed for use in the Restoration. Worst of all, he did not understand Sir Vernal Slickstone's motivation, although Snorkel's was clear enough. In the gloom of the rearmost bay of the archivoire lurked a row of shelves that held 2 deeply contrasting collections of 16th century books. One on conventional science and philosophy, neatly bound in beige leather, and beside it, black-bound, an altogether more arcane mix of works on poisons, torture, heresies, assassination, breeding patterns, and the philosophy of power. Both had once resided in the manor. Books reflect interests. Interests inform personality, and personality decides a course of action. Instinct told Flinch that these collections had been assembled by opposing forces, and if that were the case, the manor had at different times been home to both the virtuous and the malevolent. He had the uncomfortable thought that its closure all those years ago must mean that the latter had triumphed, and somehow remained a threat. But how? When flummoxed, Finch spoke out loud improvised words in nonsensical chains. It calmed him and aided contemplation, so he did so now. Worm, cast, spell, struck. How are we doing for time? Do you want a little bit more? Yay.
Oh.
Okay, I have a short chapter and a slightly longer chapter. One, both. Okay. Hydration break. Okay, chapter 7. Another point of view. In the manor, Sir Veronal reviewed progress. Masons, carpenters, carvers, roofers, gardeners, and glassmakers had done their work admirably. His morning's work at the town hall had also been encouraging. Rotherweird's history regulations prohibited both archaeology and the ownership of any historical pictures of or publications about the valley. Equally, nobody outside Rotherwierd was permitted to write about the place, thanks to an ancient Elizabethan statute. So the greater the secrecy, the greater the secret, surely. Research in London's antiquarian bookshops had uncovered one page in a small book dated 1798, which had slipped the net. The author described himself as Ambrose Claude, the vagrant vicar, and had recorded his one visit to the Rotherwierd Valley in these terms. After 2 pleasant days in Hoy, I was unable to resist the challenge of Rotherwierd. I passed 2 nights walking down the valley and 2 days sleeping in the security of her outlying woods. I had allowed my beard to grow and wore my least imposing clothes. On the following day, the weather came to my aid. The rain was so torrential, I was able to slip in unnoticed before the portcullis closed. The innkeeper was warm-hearted but wary. All I gleaned from my visit came from him. It appears that a statute in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I endowed the district with its special status. He let slip that, according to legend, there was a terrible reckoning between settlers and local inhabitants from the surrounding countryside. So terrible that special measures were needed. Even today I heard one of the former dismiss one of the latter as a countrysider. The rest of England they regard with even deeper contempt. Brain. The origins of his sense of superiority remain obscure, save that the level of learning is peculiarly high. I found myself discussing Newton's Principia Mathematica with a storekeeper in the market square. The next morning I was rudely ejected, despite the cloth. Sir Veronal turned to the mayor's original letter, oozing with deference and greed. Dear Sir Veronal, I write with due humility as Mayor of Rotherwierd, the only self-governing town in Britain. We are obliged by law to treat history with suspicion, but have an ancient manor house whose renewal we feel would appeal to a man of your refined tastes. I would require financial assistance to secure the necessary consents for an outsider like you, but trust this would be no obstacle. I must emphasize that you were brought to our attention by an impeccable source. I look forward to your early reply. Your humble and obedient servant, Sidney Snorkel. Sir Veronal binned begging letters on principle, and nothing here invoked an exception until that word, outsider. It penetrated his blocked memory, although he could remember no individual outsider, only the fact that he had hated them all. This one word, in conjunction with the peculiarity of Rotherwierd, had brought him here. Slender evidence for such a huge investment. After an additional donation to the Offshore Snorkel Foundation, the mayor identified his impeccable source as one Paul Marl, a disclosure of little assistance since, apart from a Yorkshire postman and a fisherman from Hull, neither of whom had anything to do with anything, no other person of that name existed in England, let alone Rotherwierd. Sir Veronal reread the passage from Ambrose Claude, Travelogue. He needed a source of intelligence, and the vagrant vicar had unwittingly shown the way. Mrs. Banter, proprietor of Baubles and Relics, lived in the smart quarter of town, some way from the shop, in a house that resembled its owner in physique. Solid in the body, the main building, long in the neck, the tower, with 2 beady eyes at the top for observing everyone below, 2 powerful telescopes with infrared lenses, which between them covered most of the main streets and squares. Occasionally by day, and invariably at night, with its enhanced potential for indiscretion, she ascended to the tower's top floor to conduct a round of observations, recording the results of note in a growing array of notebooks. Knowledge of people bestowed power over people. One notebook was devoted to the manor. Despite the shield of its perimeter wall, she tracked the progress of the chimneys, rebuilt in old brick, and the re-roofing in contemporary Elizabethan tiles. She
Oh no.
Andrada, we've lost you.
sits by the shiny.
The last thing we heard was Elizabethan tiles, but we can hear you now.
Okay. Elizabethan tiles. Yes. She detected a fastidious mind and considerable wealth at work. She noted the convoys bringing materials in and debris out, as well as occasional visits by the shiny black engine-powered car with the gleaming radiator and the golden weasel on the bonnet. There would surely be an opening of the restored manor, an occasion for her to shine and cement her social position. Chapter 8. Term begins. Children and teachers tramped the same journey, from home to the notice boards in the main quad of Rotherwierd School, although only the former were subjected to Miss Trimble's fastidious eye for deportment and dress. Shoulders back, socks up, shirt tails showing, and repeatedly, gum. Oblong found his 20-minute walk excruciating. Children dressed in black and brown emerged from doorways like bees, only to give him as wide a berth as his fellow teachers. The majesty of his gown brought some compensation, and at the notice boards, as in the staff room, Bessie Bolitho gave support. You'll feel like a moon in an asteroid belt, but in no time everything settles. The notice boards brought home to Oblong how few teachers he knew, and yet all the pupils appeared to know him. He heard the name Flask muttered among the sniggers behind cupped hands. Form 4 had 16 pupils. As they drifted in, they said, "Good morning, sir." Some even said, "Good morning, Mr. Oblong, sir." He made his opening address on the American Civil War. He did not get far. Girls and boys, you cannot imagine the carnage of this war, the complexity of its causes, the width of its consequences. Guess how many young men died? 750,000, said a girl at the front. Approximately. 30% of all Southern white males between 18 and 40, added the boy beside her. Oblong gulped, unsure who was teaching whom, but by the end of the lesson he had the unsettling feeling that Form 4 regarded outside history as essentially fictional. They had engaged with the statistics, but not with America as a real place. Morning drizzle turned to sleet by early afternoon, and as darkness fell, the sleet thickened into snow. By the time Oblong made it back to his lodgings, the flatter roofs and the more neglected pavements were white. Indulging one of the few gifts learned in his partly rural childhood, he lit a fire and worked through a pile of essays before cozying up by the hearth with an anthology of pastoral poetry, which made his own efforts seem inept. Below, the river boasted flecks of white where snow had settled on projecting driftwood. In such conditions, the knock on the door was wholly unexpected. He admitted a stout man in his early 60s in corduroy trousers, leather ankle boots, a mustard yellow tweed overcoat, and a black felt hat with fur trim, Russian style, which he removed as he held out his hand. Oblong recognized his observer in the journeyman's gist. Oblong? He had a hearty, enthusiastic air. His eyes twinkled. His hands were never still. Throwing his coat over the back of a chair to reveal an equally tatty tweed jacket, he heaved the canvas bag onto the table, from which emerged several bottles of Old Ferdy's Feisty Peculiar. "Best antifreeze in town," he said with a smile. "Fangwin at your service. Godfrey Fangwin." Oblong looked blank. "Don't tell me. Snorkel has expunged my name. 35 years of loyal service, and what do you get? Eternal anonymity. You see before you a veteran of Rotherwierd School. Form 4 is Fangwin. Fangwin is Form 4. or rather, was. Oblong shook Fangwin's hand warmly. Why give up? Asked Oblong. I didn't ask to be form master. I didn't ask not to be. Call it the price of an ill-judged friendship. Not Flask, blurted Oblong. Fangwin ducked the inquiry. I'm looking at a bottle, and a bottle is looking at me. In polite society, only a glass stands between us. Oblong returned from the kitchen to find Fangwin dipping into the fancy notebook in which he kept his completed poems. Not for school, I hope. Children are balladeers. They crave a rattling good meter, nifty rhymes, and a grotesque storyline. I try to get to the bottom of things, replied Oblong huffily. Fangwin slapped his thighs and guffawed before pouring out the deep ochre beer. Well, I messed that one up, didn't I? The Fangwin School of Small Talk. Not out of 10, bottom of the class. Talking of which, how are the little perishers? They're fine. Oblong softened. Fangwin's bonhomie was infectious. I rather think that they miss you. Fangwin seized the compliment as an opportunity to go through his former pupils one by one, so skillfully done that Oblong had no inkling what was happening. Ned Gully, nice boy if quiet. Attentive, said Oblong. Single child. I trust you're not. Well, actually I am, but parents are alive, surely. Only my father, and he's in a home. And so it went on, with Oblong disclosing far more about himself than Fangwin revealed about the class, including his age, his lack of a permanent home, his literary ambitions, and his limited experience of teaching, not to mention much else in life. At the end of this review, Fangwin moved from the classroom to the staff room. Oblong's good reviews for Rhombus Smith, Vesey Bolitho, and Gregorius Jones were greeted with approving nods. Likewise, his less flattering notice for Strimmer. Jones is the odd one, said Fangwin, whose discretion was slipping under the influence of the feisty peculiar. He could be an outsider like you. Really? We discovered him on a field trip in Rotherwierd, Westwood. He was running like a man possessed with no apparent destination. Primitive clothes, no money or papers, not even a name except Gregorius. Rhombus took him in, upgraded his name to Gregorius, and after a year or two, made him our first head of PE. Noble savage turns gym master. A coup, as it turned out. Everyone likes Gregorius Jones. Why do you all have such outlandish names? Do we? Fangwin sounded genuinely surprised, but almost everyone Oblong had met had at least one strange name, and some, two. In all things, Rotherwierd went its own way. After his eulogy to Gregorius Jones, Fangwin clambered to his feet and raised his glass. I give you Form 4, past and present, he boomed before downing what remained of his fourth bottle. Oblong, still on his second, followed suit. As he sat down, Fangwin made an offer. Can I help with anything? I do mean anything. What does North Tower do? Fangwin's bonhomie waned a fraction. They design weapon technologies which Rotherwierd sells discreetly to the outside world. Due to our limited facilities and manpower, it's mostly blueprints with occasional prototypes. The South Tower, by contrast, designs toys and distractions, also for worldwide distribution. Strimmer regards Bolitho and his team as juveniles. Bolitho regards Strimmer and his acolytes as moral degenerates. The town hall does nothing to discourage the enmity. It encourages competition, which in turn increases the revenue from both. Oblong squirmed in his chair. You've another question, I think? You know how you always take over from someone. In my case, there's you and the other one, Mr. Flask. I've seen exercise books with the names rubbed out. I mean, as if it's Dead Man's Shoes, suggested Fangwin. After weeks of evasion, the bluntness shocked. Well, let's say Robert Flask left abruptly. Oblong blurted out his next question. The mayor implied he taught early history against the rules. Fangwin, whose eyesight had appeared impeccable, began polishing a pair of spectacles with a spotted handkerchief, a theatrical performance designed to give maximum effect to his reply. Oh no, replied Fangwin. Robert Flask didn't teach old history. He did something far worse. He went in search of it. I see. He wasn't called Flask for nothing, like the jar of the old peculiar did Robert. But after he vanished, I never heard a squeak. Thin air job, nobody knows where he went. Oblong tried again to elucidate Fangwin's own fate. But why is your name scrubbed out too? I did the decent thing. I didn't report it. Report what? Flask broke cover one morning and told the forum some most inappropriate things about history. Fangwin paused. Still, as you're his and my successor, you'd best have this. He handed Oblong a small plastic bag bound with elastic bands. That's Robert Flask's notebook, what's left of it. How did you get it? His general person found it in a drawer. Not tags. Hair like a bottle brush, teeth like tusks, and a heart of gold. Why did she bring this to you? Muttered Mr. Oblong, remembering her denial of any connection with Flask. I was Flask's best friend, and the young Ags looked after me in my bachelor days. Where could Flask have gone? Something was up. He moved from nice rooms in the school to a seedy back street. A few days later he'd vanished. Puff of smoke. Guess he'd had enough of Rotherwierd. Fangwin peered at his watch, hurriedly put on his coat and hat, and shook Oblong's hand with alarming vigor. Be sure to keep in touch. You have much to contribute, I feel certain of it. With that, Fangwin rolled precariously down the steep staircase and out into the night. Oblong went straight to the package. The pages of the notebook had been ripped out. Inside the front cover, the name Robert Flask had been written in ink with the address of his first lodging, Exterior School Tower East, 3rd floor, but was otherwise blank. On the back inside cover was written the following in ink, in stilted handwriting. Stole car, ASC 1017. The banal entry hardly justified Fangwin's theatrical presentation. Oblong was not interested in vehicle theft, still less a vehicle this old, but he hid the remains of the notebook in his sock drawer, just in case. Fangwin plodded home, finding it hard to resist the urge to self-pity. He lived for his class, and his dismissal had left him bereft. He liked the outsider, although Oblong lacked the charisma required for high-tier teaching. The contrast with Flask could hardly be greater. Flask had played the fool to get the post, only to display a ferocious intellect as he set about befriending Rotherweird's more maverick citizens and chasing down her remote history. Fangwin hoped the notebook might hold a clue as to why and where Oblong's predecessor had disappeared. If Flask had been onto something of importance, and he could discover it, might he not get his post back? In this endeavor he expected competition. Flask's other close friend Strimmer, whom Fangwin cordially disliked, was not a man to leave stones unturned if what lurked beneath might offer him power. Flask, ever playing off one friend against another, had hinted to Fangwin that he had confided important information to Strimmer. Another matter troubled Fangwin. His downfall stemmed from a notorious history lesson, in which Flask had encouraged Form 4 to investigate the town's origins. The pupils reported this crime to Fangwin, who decided to not report his friend to the headmaster or the town hall. Then Flask vanished. The truth seeped out, and Fangwin paid the ultimate price for his loyalty. But why would Flask, hitherto so careful as to what he said to whom, commit professional suicide in such a flagrant way? Hopefully, in the new historian's hands, the strange notebook would yield the answer. He felt a familiar tickle in his throat, an irritation that alcohol caused, cured, and caused again. The journeyman's gist had endured a quiet night, custom halved by the weather. Bill Ferdy, the landlord, put out the fires, cleared the glasses, squared the accounts, discharged the staff, and locked the tills. He helped himself to a pint of sturdy and sat by the fire. With conditions treacherous, sleeping overnight in the pub appeared sensible, even though it was illegal for countrysiders. Nobody would know. He had already warned his wife Megan of the possibility. He reflected on his good fortune. He had the only pub in town, and was more tolerated than any other countrysider. He grew his own hops and brewed his own beer. He had 3 delightful children. Gwen was unusual, true, but her mathematical gifts were a source of pride. He was dozing when there was a knock at the door. 1 a.m., long past closing time. A tall man with strangely neutral coloring stood in the doorway, his dress expensive, and not to Rotherwierd tastes. Bill Ferdy, he spoke impersonally, as if making an arrest. Bar be closed, I'm afraid. I drink only the best. A leather suitcase stood in the snow beside the man's feet. Bill Ferdy was not in the mood for confrontation. He decided to hear him out. The man sat down at the nearest table. The name is Slickstone. Is that a first name or a second one? I am Sir Verinal Slickstone, and I'm here to make you an offer. 800,000 for the pub, no strings. Pence? Laughed the landlord. Guineas, replied Sir Verinal with the straightest of faces. Bill Ferdy gawped. The lease was renewable every 7 years, and not worth a fraction of his visitor's offer. It's a bit sudden. The pub has been in our family since. The best offers are sudden. The secret is accepting before they vanish. Give me a day or two. No time. Sir Verinal took several brown envelopes out of the bag and a 1-page agreement in duplicate. Here is a 10% deposit and your copy of the contract. You have only to sign. Bill Ferdy reflected. Gwen was unlikely to take up the reins, but one of her brothers might. Nor had he any idea what to do with such money. All he could think of using it for was repairing and restoring the more dilapidated parts of a pub that would no longer be his. That triggered a thought. Would you keep the journeyman's gist going? I would keep the pub. With Ferdy beer? I would keep the pub. But for this price, I do not expect questions. Yes or no? The blunt reply brought Bill Ferdy to his senses. He was landlord of the only pub for miles, which brought happiness to many, and therefore to him. It was without price. Thanks, but no. I always get my way, Mr. Ferdy. Ferdy suppressed a surge of dislike. A sir can buy anything, he seemed to be saying, including the right to threaten strangers. I'm locking up, he replied curtly. Without a good night, his visitor strode off into the night. And this is the end of today's session.
He's gonna turn it into a Weatherspoons.
No!
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty much that kind of situation.
It's Tim.
There's going to be a Scooby-Doo style reveal at the end where they've got him tied up and then they pull off his mask and like, Tim Martin! And I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for bloody Brussels.
Oh, that was awesome.
That was super fucking awesome. I was really spacey today, not gonna lie. I'm gonna have to go back and listen for details, but every moment I was paying attention, I was like, why wasn't I listening better before? Damn it, brain. This is so good.
What's the deal with Rotherwierd? Why aren't they allowed to learn history?
Dun, dun, dun.
Duncan knows. That's what he's saying.
I also know, but that's like the main thing in the book.
Dun,
Why is-
dun, dun.
Why is Skinner such an unmitigated cunt?
Skinner?
What's his name? The guy who's like an asshole with the dog.
Strimmer.
Strimmer.
There you go.
Also, why is everybody named after objects there?
Ah.
Yeah, like oblong and shit.
Yeah, well,
The
it's
names
Strimmer,
will
like
be
a grass
revealed
trimmer.
later in the
Oh,
books.
I know they will, but I'm just asking the questions, Andrada.
Some of these
I
are
know,
questions I haven't
but
even thought
there was-
about. I didn't notice the oblongities.
The oblongities.
Yeah, like the oblong oddities, the oblongities.
They were, like a lot of
The-
people have names
yeah.
after things. Maybe they're all things. Maybe they're not people. Maybe they're all things.
Maybe it's all in the Matrix.
Yes. Shall we say goodbye to
I
the-
think you're kind of onto something there. Not quite things, but
No spoilers. We should
something
get back
else.
to the catch up crew before we reveal more spoilers by accident because we think about them.
Yeah.
No, there's no spoiler. But did you notice the irony of Oblong being why all have such weird names and his name is
Oblong. I know.
Oblong.
Yes. I was like, what?
Because
And
he's really
also-
from Rotherwierd secretly. Duh.
Oh fuck!
I
He
like
wasn't
that
an outsider at all.
He was
No,
on the
he's-
inner
he's-
circle all along.
All along.
All oblong.
He
Oh,
was in
inner-
the inner oval then. No, he couldn't have been on the inner circle.
The inner parallelogram? I don't fucking know.
The inner rhombus.
But that's just a tangential thought. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, I just got it. Good work.
Thank you.
You were just being a square for a sec. So good.
Nah.
Mate.
Mate.
The wrong rectangle.
What? That isn't anything.
I know. I really need to just quit while I'm ahead, don't I? Anyways,
Maybe we should put a point into this, or what's it called? No, we should have. Damn it.
You guys are being very obtuse.
End the sentence.
Maybe we should just stop the suffering of the
We'll stop.
catch-up
It
crew
will
at this
just
point.
Yeah, I think we should approach this at a completely different angle, guys.
Thank you.
Very good.
catch-up crew. Catch-up crew. Catch-up crew.
Triangles.
I hope that you're all acuter than I just was with them bad puns.
Oh, fuck off.
They need to get used to the shape of things to come.
Oh, very good.
Oh,
Maybe one day we can just come full circle with this.
and on that note, goodbye, catch-up crew.
Bye, good.